Tonight's story begins in a hole, one filled with human waste, no treasure, no gold, just centuries of fermented misery. And lucky you, that's where you work. But before we begin, please take a moment to comment where you're from and what time it is for you. It's always intriguing to see who's joining us from around the world. You're a gong farmer. Farmer is generous. There are no crops, only dung. Soggy, clumped, sometimes fossilized into what scholars politely call night soil. You live in 14th century England, and someone has to dig it out. That someone is you. Now you're not a magician. You don't believe that waste just vanishes. Chamber pots, emptied straight into the streets, on a good day. But in castles, manors, and wealthier homes, things are a bit more vertical. They have guardrobes, fancy shafts where waste drops from 3 floors up into a pit below. Out of sight, out of nose. Except it's never really gone. It seeps, it swells, it bubbles. And when that pit begins to gurgle, that's your cue. You grab your shovel, your bucket, your courage, or maybe just your deadened sense of smell, and get to work. You operate at night. Not because you like the moonlight, but because your job is legally banned during the day. The stench is so overwhelming, it's a public hazard. You descend into the pit, chest deep in ancient rot. One scoop at a time. The bucket fills with brown sludge, rat skeletons, used cloths, bits of bone. And sometimes, if you're having a really bad night, something human that didn't make it back out. You lug it out, dump it beyond the town walls onto a dung heap. Sometimes you sell it to real farmers. Yes, someone pays for this. Night soil is fertilizer. Waste not, want not. The smell. You don't talk about the smell, no one does. A monk once described it as a curse upon nostrils and God. Another simply muttered, hell is nearer than you think. You can't argue. But here's the twist. You're paid well. Better than most craftspeople. Because no one else wants to do it. Because you risk death from gas pockets, cave-ins, infections. You shovel with dignity. You survive. And if you're lucky, you might afford bread and onions. People avoid you. Some pity you. Some respect you from afar, like one might respect a thunderstorm. They step aside when your gong wagon rolls through, sloshing with horror. You've got hazards, of course. You might faint from fumes, drown in muck, be eaten alive by rats. But you've also got steady work. And in the Middle Ages, that's rare. By the 1500s, your profession has rules, guilds, even minor fame. You might clear a castle in a week. You might be remembered. You might, one day, whisper to yourself, just a few more buckets, then maybe I can afford shoes. But when you're not shoveling cities clean from below, you're in the countryside, knee-deep in a swamp, letting your blood be eaten alive. I bet you didn't think you were going to be a leech collector, did you? Not a doctor, not a scholar. Your job now is to walk into putrid marshes and let leeches feast on your legs. Because in the Middle Ages, leeches aren't gross. They're sacred. Too much blood? Drain it. Feeling ill, sinful, or overly emotional? That's your blood acting up. Leeches solve all. So you find them the only way they'll let you. You offer yourself. Bare legs, careful steps. You wade into the filth and stand still. Wait. And slowly, the leeches come. They latch on. Dozens. You feel the tingle of their saliva, nature's anaesthetic. They drink. You bleed. Then you pluck them off, gently, drop them into jars. Careless collectors end up with embedded jaws, wounds that ooze for hours. But you're a professional, sort of. You're paid by volume. A morning's work might earn enough for a hunk of bread and maybe a dry place to sleep. Your legs are covered in sores. Infections are common. Sometimes you faint from blood loss. Sometimes people disappear into the bog and are never found again. You wonder if they became part of the marsh, or part of the leeches. Doctors, monks, and surgeons rely on you. One monastery uses over 20,000 leeches in a year, and you helped make that happen. In winter, you smash through ice, stand for hours in water that steals your colour and your feeling. Your skin turns purple, but still, you wait, because bloodletting must go on. Some ponds double as cesspits. The waste of villages ends up in the same water you're bleeding into. You can smell the gong farmers' work even out here. And yet, you persist. You are the supplier, the bleeder, the bog walker. No one thanks you. No one even looks at you. But you keep going, because someone has to. And in the grim book of medieval survival, your name, whether whispered in cesspits or marshes, will always be there. Are there any jobs worse than the leech farmer? Well, among the many unlucky souls paid to meddle with medieval bodies, few faced as much day-to-day gore as the surgeon. Not the kind in ivory robes quoting Galen. No, this was the travelling cut man. The man with a sack full of blades and a reputation for strong wrists and stronger stomachs. His job? Deal with what everyone else avoided, pus. Medieval Europe was a swollen, suppurating continent. People lived in filth, wounds got dirty, teeth went bad, armpits and groins turned into battlegrounds of inflammation. When that happened, you called in someone to open things up, before they burst on their own. The surgeon didn't ask many questions. He sat the patient down, peeled back whatever rags passed for clothing, and took a good look. If the lump was soft and warm, infected, if it oozed, better. And if it pulsed like it had its own heartbeat, he knew exactly what to do. He reached for the lancet. Sterilisation wasn't a thing yet. Tools were wiped on aprons or dipped briefly in wine if the client was fancy. Most blades had already seen several armpits and groins that day, but that didn't stop the surgeon. He found the softest part of the swelling, usually the most tender, pink, glistening patch, and pressed in, slow but firm. The result? A sound. Half hiss, half squelch. Then the pus came. Yellow, white, green, sometimes streaked with blood. Thick as porridge. Sometimes thin and acidic. Sometimes chunky, like bad yogurt. If the smell hit him in the face like a slap, it meant the infection was serious. He'd press the abscess with his thumbs, milking it like a cow. Patients howled. Some passed out. Others bit down on sticks or screamed curses at the saints. But when it was over, there was relief. Pain gave way to emptiness. The body, lighter by a pint of poison. And then came the dressing. Linen strips soaked in wine, vinegar, honey, or, if supplies were low, just whatever was on hand. Maybe mashed onions, maybe cobwebs, maybe nothing. Surgeons were part miracle workers, part butchers. They didn't just drain boils. They pulled teeth, stitched sword wounds, amputated fingers, and removed embedded arrowheads, all with the same set of tools, all without washing their hands. They were paid in coin, bread, or favours, sometimes in silence, sometimes in curses when the wound came back worse a week later. But puce was part of life, and someone had to face it head on. But let's suppose you were a king in the Middle Ages. Finally, right? Power, prestige, a throne carved from oak, servants, banners, roast swan on silver platters. And yet, you're still miserable. You wake up each morning to the sound of chamber pots being emptied from the windows. Not yours, you have a guardrobe, but the rest of your castle still stinks like a cattle market married a brewery. Your sheets itch. Fleas? Always fleas. No one can get rid of them. Not even the barber surgeon who swears rubbing vinegar behind your ears will discourage the vermin. It doesn't. The vermin are encouraged. You don't rule so much as negotiate with nobles who plot behind your back, bishops who remind you you're sinful, and your own cousins who quietly think you'd look better with a sword in your ribs and a crown on their head. But your meals are extravagant. Half the kingdom starves, but you dine on boar, pheasant, eel pie. Still, your stomach groans. Meat's been sitting for days. Bread is rock hard. The wine is suspiciously chewy. You eat anyway. You can't show weakness. Your wife? Chosen for politics. Your mistress? Chosen for survival. Your children? Pawns. You parade them like fresh-cut roses before alliances, betroth them off by age 12, and pray they don't die of fever before the paperwork is signed. And yet everyone calls you majesty. They kneel, they bow, they sing songs in your honour, but none of them sleep with one eye open like you do. Because ruling isn't about grandeur. It's about keeping your head attached. Every toast could be poison. Every hunt and ambush, every monk in your court could be slipping notes to a rival duke who wants your lands, your legacy, and your seat still warm. The truth is, you're not above the filth. You're just slightly further from the pit. Even your own knights whisper when you leave the hall. They know what happened to the last king. So do you. You drink less, trust less, smile less, but you wear the crown. And that means something. At least you try to tell yourself that anyway. One of the worst jobs imaginable in the Middle Ages was being a fuller. Your job is to spend your days standing barefoot in a wooden vat filled with rotting human urine and unwashed sheep hair, stomping cloth until your legs turn to jelly and your dignity evaporates in the fumes. You're not doing this once. You're doing it for hours, every day. Welcome to your life. The job is called fulling, a necessary, revolting step in making wool soft and wearable. When raw wool comes off the sheep, it's greasy, full of lanolin, oil, sweat, and fecal hitchhikers. To make it usable, someone has to strip it down. You're that someone. Now here's the secret sauce. Urine. Not fresh. That's useless. You need the aged stuff. Left in buckets until it ferments into a sour, eye-watering brew packed with ammonia. Great for breaking down grease, terrible for skin, worse for the soul. Where do you get it? Simple. You collect it from public piss pots. Yes, your town has designated jars and barrels placed outside homes and taverns, where people relieve themselves for the greater good. Families donate their waste, like it's alms for the poor. Some even get paid for it. You, unfortunately, pay for it in other ways. Once the vat is full and frothy, you climb in, stripped to your tunic, or nothing at all if it's hot. The wool floats on the surface like drowned hay. Your job is to stomp, mash, churn, wring out the sins of the sheep with your own two legs. It's not elegant, it's not rhythmic, it's not sanitary, it splashes, it soaks, it burns. Your feet sting within minutes, your skin blisters. If you've got any cuts, and you do, every step feels like baptism in acid. If you get it in your mouth, congratulations, you've just tasted the public. The smell? Legendary. So bad they built fulling houses downwind, on the outskirts of town, where the wind could carry your shame into the next parish. Even then, people complain. You smell yourself constantly. Your hands stay pruned. Your feet stay red and raw. No one wants to marry a fuller, not unless they're desperate, or blind, or both. But you're needed, desperately. Without you, people would still be wearing raw, greasy sheep coats. So you stomp, and the wool keeps coming. When the soaking is done, you drag out the soggy mass, heavy, steaming, smelling like Satan's laundry, and begin stage 2, the pounding. You haul the cloth to a flat board and beat it. With wooden mallets, with your fists, with whatever doesn't dissolve in piss. You do this to shrink it, tighten it, bind the fibres. You're not just washing it, you're reshaping it. You're helping the fabric forget it ever touched an animal. And just when you think you're done, you're not, because there's more wool waiting, always more wool. Cartloads arrive, some fresh, some already in the early stages of death. You pray to work outdoors where the air at least has somewhere to go, but if you're unlucky, you work inside a fulling mill. Picture this, a hot room, no windows, no ventilation. Ammonia hangs in the air like an invisible fog, turning your lungs to leather and your eyes to soup. You don't change clothes. You can't. You go home soaked. You go to bed soaked. You wake up already halfway back in the vat. The smell is part of you. It doesn't come off. Not with water, not with prayer. You are the soap. Children point at you in the street. Priests make jokes at your expense from the pulpit. At the tavern, no one sits beside you, unless they're drunk enough to smell nothing or smell worse. And then comes winter. The piss is still there, just colder. Ice forms on the surface. Your feet go numb the second they touch it. You keep stomping. Because if the cloth stops, so do the wages. Your legs swell, your toes turn black. Some days, you can't feel your knees until bedtime. Some nights, you can't feel them at all. You're paid but not well. You're vital but invisible. You're filthy. But without you, cloaks stay crusty and nobles complain. And just when someone needs a fine wool tunic or a clean cloak, they suddenly remember you. They don't thank you. They don't pay you more, but they stop insulting you for one afternoon. Then they go back to forgetting, and you go back to the vat, back to the stomp, back to the sting, because without you, the kingdom would be naked and scratching. Now, if you wanted to work with your hands in the Middle Ages, really get involved with your craft, you could become a tanner. Or worse, a tannery apprentice. Tanners made leather, boots, belts, armour, gloves, horse tack. It was valuable, durable, essential. But turning animal skin into something wearable wasn't alchemy. It was gore, grease, rot, and a long, long bath in liquefied dog poop and cow brains. And guess who hauled the buckets? The apprentice. The process started with fresh hides, straight from the slaughterhouse. Still warm, still hairy, still faintly twitching if you picked them up too soon. Blood still clung, flies already buzzing. The smell was meaty, wet, wrong. You didn't clean them in water, you soaked them in urine, sometimes for days. The ammonia helped loosen the hair. After soaking, you scraped the skin with curved knives, called fleshing, to remove any remaining fat tissue or bits of whatever the butcher missed. This released a smell so foul, even gong farmers crossed the street. But it got worse. Once de-haired, the hides were soaked in a mixture of cow dung and animal brains. No, really. The enzymes broke down the collagen and softened the fibres. Dung from dogs was especially prized. Apprentices collected it in buckets, sometimes directly from the source. The mixture was stirred, by hand. If you were lucky, you used a stick. If not, you used a paddle. If there weren't enough paddles, you guessed it, hands and feet. The smell wasn't just bad, it was physical. It grabbed your throat, curled your tongue, sank into your clothes, and made the back of your skull itch. The tannery stank so violently that entire quarters of cities were built around the wind direction, just to avoid the fumes. Your skin blistered. Your nails turned yellow. Your clothes rotted faster than you could patch them. Your lungs burned, your eyes watered constantly. And if you stayed in the business long enough, you developed what they called the tanner's wheeze. A wet, rattling cough you could hear coming before you saw it. But apprentices couldn't complain. They worked from dawn until dusk, dragging hides, stirring vats, scraping skins, dumping waste, sleeping near the workshop if they weren't lucky enough to rent a space far away. No one envied them, not even gong farmers. And if you died early, well, at least you didn't have to finish the hide pile. In the Middle Ages, death was everywhere, but not the noble kind sung in ballads. This was the slow, wet kind. It began with a cough, then fever, then black spots, hard lumps under the armpits, in the groin, on the neck. Breathing turned shallow, skin turned purple, and soon nothing turned at all. Now imagine this happening in every house on your street, every alley, every village. The year is 1348. The Black Death has arrived in Europe, and while nobles fled, priests prayed, and doctors wept into their masks stuffed with herbs, the bodies kept piling up. Fast, too fast, and someone, anyone, had to clean up. In the chaos, a new profession formed, not honoured, not envied, not even properly named. They were just the buriers. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't safe, it wasn't optional either. Cities offered silver to the desperate, bread to the starving, pardons to the condemned. If you could carry a body and keep breathing, congratulations, you were hired. The work started before dawn. First, the cart, wooden, creaking, rimmed with dried blood and whatever had leaked the night before. The wheels were clogged with mud and worse. No horses, no oxen, just your hands and back. You dragged the cart down narrow alleys, knocking on doors. No one answered. You didn't need them to. The smell told you what was behind each door. Sweet and rotten. The scent of decay soaked into wood, into cloth, into your skin. The corpses inside weren't peaceful. They were twisted, curled into final gasps, eyes open, mouths frozen mid-scream, covered in boils, blackened at the fingertips, leaking fluids, that no medieval physician could name. There were no gloves, no masks. If you were lucky, you wrapped a rag around your face and stuffed it with vinegar-soaked straw. It didn't work. The smell still got through. It always did. You lifted the bodies by the arms, the legs, whatever held together. Children, elders, entire families. Some were light as air. Others had bloated beyond recognition. You tried not to look at the faces, but sometimes you recognized them. Your neighbour, the innkeeper, the boy who sold onions 3 days ago. The cart filled slowly, then quickly, then too quickly. When it overflowed, you piled bodies on top of bodies, arms hanging off the sides, hair caught in the wheels, blood and pus dripped down the boards. Sometimes a body fell off mid-journey. If no one was watching, you left it. If someone was watching, you cursed and lifted it back up, teeth clenched. And all this was just the collection. The burial was worse. Mass graves were dug in the outskirts, trenches 20 feet wide, as long as the land allowed. The earth was too dry or too wet. The air buzzed with flies, dogs circled, wild-eyed and hungry. So did rats. You rolled the bodies in. No last rites, no names, no markers, just layers of the dead, covered in a thin film of dirt. Then more bodies, then more dirt, until the pit was full. But it never stayed full for long. New orders came in, another street, another alley, another load, and always the question hung in the back of your throat, heavier than the corpses. When will it be your turn? Because the plague didn't care that you worked for the city, that you were helping, that you were essential. The plague had no favourites, and every cough in the air felt personal. Every boil you spotted on your arm, it made you wonder if you'd lifted the wrong child, touched the wrong sheet, inhaled a little too deeply. But you kept going, because even the dead had to be moved, and because no one else would. But the dead didn't stay quiet. They swelled, they burst, they leaked through the cloth they were wrapped in. Sometimes they twitched, hours after you knew they were gone. Muscles firing one last time, nerves misfiring. Death was not clean. It was messy and wet and loud in all the wrong ways. You learned not to flinch. The worst were the ones that waited. The homes where they hadn't yet gone cold, where the sick hovered between life and rot, gasping in the shadows. Some would reach out as you passed, begging for water, mercy, death. Others just stared, silent, as if they already knew you'd be back for them tomorrow. And you would. You always came back. Not because you wanted to, but because the piles didn't stop growing. Not even when you ran out of pits. At some point the ground refused to open any further. It caved in, collapsed in on itself. Bones stuck out like broken fence posts. Dogs pulled arms from shallow soil. Rain flooded the trenches and stirred up a soup of mud and marrow. The city didn't care. It had no more space. It had no more strength. So you kept stacking. You learned to layer bodies like firewood. Faces turned away. Limbs crossed tight to save space. Ash and lime sprinkled between layers, if there was lime. Usually there wasn't. The smell told the truth anyway. Acrid, oily, tangy, with that sweet edge that only comes when death has fermented. The clothes rotted with the flesh. Everything fused together in the pit. Skin to cloth, cloth to skin, head to shoulder to chest. Sometimes the heat of decomposition made it feel warm when you touched them, like they were still alive, but they weren't. Most of the time. Some you'd swear had moved. The real danger, though, wasn't the dead. It was what followed them. Rats, big ones, small ones, grey, black, brown, teeth yellow like old parchment, eyes shiny as buttons. They travelled in clusters, families of filth. You'd lift a corpse and find a nest underneath. Sometimes the rats fled, sometimes they didn't. They'd stare, daring you to move them. You kicked, they bit, and you swore, but there were always more. People said the rats brought the plague, but you knew better. The fleas brought the plague, the rats brought the fleas, and the corpses, they brought all of it. You couldn't escape them. They crawled into boots, into blankets, into dreams. You'd wake up scratching, swearing, weeping, and in the back of your mind, you wondered if that itch meant something worse. But you didn't have time to check. Some buriers wore hoods, some tied waxed cloth around their ankles. It didn't matter. You still bled, still burned with fever, still waited every morning to see if you woke up coughing. You weren't alone. There were others, men with carts, women with shovels, a few younger boys too, orphans usually, with nothing left to lose. No one spoke unless they had to. Voices meant breath, breath meant risk, so mostly there were just nods and grunts, and the occasional muffled prayer, half whispered while tossing in another set of bones. The smell clung to you, through your hair, your clothes, your fingernails. You could scrub with vinegar, with ashes, with sand, but it wouldn't go. People avoided you. They'd cross the road, turn away, spit at your feet, as if you were death itself. And maybe you were. The priest said burying the dead was a holy act, that you were protecting the living, that God smiled on your service, but it didn't feel holy. It felt like hauling sacks of meat through hell. Some days you didn't eat, couldn't. The scent was too strong. You tried chewing mint leaves, candied fennel, even charcoal, but every time you raised food to your mouth, the taste twisted into something wrong, into pus, into rot. Sleep didn't help either. When you closed your eyes, they came back. The faces, the gasping mouths, the sound of a jaw unhinging as you lifted the body too fast. The memory of a child slipping from your arms and hitting the carts with a sound you never wanted to hear again. And in the middle of the night, you'd feel something crawl across your chest. Was it a flea, a rat, or just your own heartbeat, still marching forward, refusing to stop? Some buriers cracked. They drank. They shouted at ghosts. They stood at the edge of the pit and argued with the sky. A few walked into the trenches themselves, arms raised, tears cutting clean tracks down cheeks smeared with filth. But most of you just kept going. Because what else was there? No one wanted to become a burier, but once you did, you didn't leave. Not because of loyalty, but because no one else would take you. You were tainted, marked. The stink of the pit followed you, the memory of it too. You could scrub your skin raw, change your name, move to another town, but you'd still wake up to the sound of wheels creaking and bodies thudding into dirt. You could never go back to who you were. And eventually, you wouldn't have to, because no matter how strong you were, how careful, how fast you worked, the plague was patient. It waited in the folds of cloth, on the lip of a cartwheel, in the crack of your nail, where a flea bit you and you forgot to wash. It came for you the same way it came for them. And when it did, if you had a friend, or even just someone with the same cart, you'd be picked up with the same rough hands you once used on others. No special treatment, no speeches, just a lift, a grunt, and a final roll into the pit. And the work didn't stop, not even after you were gone. And someone else, someone hungrier, sicker, more desperate, would pull on your boots, grip the same handles, and begin the route, your route. At the end of the day, life continued, if you could even call it that. Because the Middle Ages weren't just about war or plague or the occasional peasant uprising. For most people, most days, it was about surviving the muck, literally. The average medieval town wasn't built with beauty in mind, or hygiene, or airflow. It was built wherever the ground was flat enough and the wolves weren't too bold. Streets were narrow, crooked. Cobblestones, if present, were uneven, slippery, and often stained with, well, everything. Human waste, animal droppings, fish guts, ale, blood. Pick something. It's on the street. You walk through it in shoes made of stitched leather or wooden patterns if you were lucky. If not, bare feet, cold, calloused, and always damp. Rain didn't wash the filth away. It stirred it, turned alleys into brown soup, turned corners into traps. It soaked through door frames and seeped into beds. And when it dried, the smell lingered like a curse. The average home was one room, maybe two if you had coin or status. The floor was dirt, packed hard at first, then slowly churned by feet, spills, and whatever came in on your boots. Straw was scattered on top for comfort. It absorbed the smells. Temporarily. When it got too filthy, you added fresh straw. Sometimes you dug out the old layer. Sometimes you just pressed it down and pretended. In the centre of the room, a fire. Smoke curled upward toward the ceiling, which had no chimney. Just a hole if you were lucky, a cloud of choking soot if you weren't. Your lungs got used to it. Or they didn't. The walls were wattle and daub, sticks, mud and manure, insulated with whatever was lying around, rags, moss, dried dung. Some houses had windows, but they were more concept than function. A wooden shutter, maybe greased parchment to let in light but not wind. Glass, that was for churches. You shared this space with everyone. Parents, grandparents, children, occasionally a pig or a goat. Privacy was a luxury. So was silence. People slept on straw mattresses, or benches, or just the floor. No sheets, no pillows. Blankets were fur or old cloaks, often shared. You turned together at night like logs on a fire. The family chamber pot sat in the corner. It filled fast. Someone, usually the youngest, was sent to empty it every morning. Down the street, into the gutter, onto the pile, wherever, no questions. Most villagers rose with the sun and went to bed when it set. Candles were expensive, oil lamps smoked, and you couldn't afford to burn precious fuel just to stare at each other after dusk. Instead, you talked, told stories, picked lice from hair, whispered about dreams, cursed the cold, listened for wolves. Work was constant. Even the smallest child had a task. Feed the chickens, stir the pot, spin wool, watch the fire, keep the pig from wandering into the stew again. Adults toiled in fields, chopped wood, thatched roofs, mended fences, hauled water. There was no day off, no weekend, no retirement. If your body hurt, you ignored it. If your legs swelled, you limped. If your teeth rotted, you swallowed pain and bled quietly into your bread. There were few doctors, fewer remedies, mostly herbs and hope, but not all was misery. There was laughter, sharp and sarcastic. People made fun of their neighbours, their own misfortunes, the lumpy turnips in the stew. Jokes were dark and earthy, just like everything else. Music played during feasts, pipes, fiddles, voices loud with drink. Dances in the square, mummers' plays, gossip, flirtation, fights. The joy wasn't clean or pretty, but it was real. And food, bread, always bread, coarse, dense, full of grit from stone-ground flour. It wore your teeth down slowly but steadily. Porridge in the morning, if there was grain. Turnips, beans, cabbage boiled until it surrendered. Meat was rare unless you raised it yourself, or poached. And if you poached, you risked more than a scolding. Lords took their games seriously. Ale flowed freely. Water wasn't trusted. Not because people didn't understand hygiene, but because they did. They'd seen what flowed down the gutters. Ale was safer. Also, it dulled the edges of everything. Bathing happened, occasionally. In rivers, if the weather allowed. In wooden tubs, if you had one. In sweat lodges, if your village had clever hands and time. But for the most part, you scrubbed with a cloth, changed your shirt once a season, and hoped your neighbours smelled worse than you. Disease was constant. You didn't need the plague to fall ill. Coughs lingered for months, wounds festered, fevers came without warning, and childbirth, the most natural thing in the world, was a game of dice played with blood. Midwives helped, so did prayers, so did charms carved into doorposts or hung above beds. Saints were busy. And yet, people lived, they married, they danced barefoot in mud, they carved faces into bread on holy days. They dyed eggs, told ghost stories, made fun of bishops. They found joy between the cracks. They didn't expect comfort. They expected hardship. And they met it with calloused hands, grim smiles, and the unshakable belief that if you kept your fire lit and your bread warm, tomorrow might just come. Even if it smelled like something had died in the corner, it didn't matter. When you're hungry, you stop asking questions. Bread was everything in the Middle Ages. breakfast, dinner, a poor man's plate, a rich man's table decoration. It soaked up stew, held salt pork, acted as a spoon, and sometimes doubled as a napkin. But calling it food was generous. Bread was more of an edible gamble, starting with the flour. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't sifted, bleached, or carefully milled in sparkling facilities. It was crushed between two massive slabs of stone. The result? Grit, literal stone dust. It gave the flour weight and gave your molars a slow, grinding death. And that was before you added the bugs. Because flour wasn't stored in jars or metal bins. It was dumped in sacks that sat on dirt floors, in dark corners, near animals. It was the buffet of choice for weevils, mites, and moth larvae, and no one had the time or energy to pick them out. You scooped the flour, bugs and all, into your dough. If you baked quickly, you might kill the insects. If not, they simply moved in. Mealworms curled into the crevices of the crust. Moth larvae burrowed deep into the sponge, baked and buried like raisins, but crunchier. The smell of fresh bread came with a side of scorched beetle, and it got worse when you were poor. Rye was cheaper than wheat, but in a wet year, rye got infected with ergot, a parasitic fungus that looked like little black claws growing on the grain. If you milled it anyway, congratulations. You just made hallucinogenic bread. Eat enough, and you'd vomit uncontrollably, feel your limbs burn like fire, and, if unlucky, watch your fingers turn black and fall off. In some towns, entire communities convulsed through winter, screaming about demons, while their feet rotted in their boots. They called it St. Anthony's Fire. Doctors blamed bad air, priests blamed sin, but it was the bread. If your loaf didn't drive you mad, it might still kill you slowly. Mould was everywhere. Some loaves were green before they cooled. Others turned blue, fluffy and slippery to the touch. Still, nothing went to waste. Mouldy bread was toasted, scraped, boiled in broth, or fed to children too young to complain. If you soaked it in ale long enough, the sour edge disappeared, mostly, and all of this was preferable to eating nothing. Now if the bread didn't break your teeth, the meat was there to test your stomach. Meat was rare, expensive, often illegal, if it came from the wrong forest or the wrong lord's flock, but when it was available, people clung to it like salvation, whether it was fresh, foul, or halfway to resurrection. Let's begin with the pig. Every village had one. Not a pen of pigs, a singular shared pig. It lived off kitchen scraps, manure piles, and whatever it could root up from the filth behind the tavern. These animals weren't pink and polished like modern farmyard cartoons. They were hairy, angry, flea-ridden little demons with tusks and attitude, and they smelled like Satan's compost pile. When it was time to slaughter, everyone came out. It was a community event. Squealing, blood spurting, hot steam rising from the slit throat. The carcass was hung on a wooden frame, not for hygiene, but convenience. Flies gathered immediately. So did the dogs. The butcher shooed them away, with one hand while gutting with the other. The innards were still warm when they were pulled. The intestines were scraped out with a knife, flushed with water, if available, and hung to dry. These would become sausage casings, assuming the rats didn't get to them first. The head was boiled into jelly. The feet were salted and boiled again. The fat was rendered, bones cracked for marrow, blood collected in buckets for pudding. Nothing was wasted. Even the bladder had uses, if not for storage, then as a children's toy. Inflated, tied off, and kicked around the yard until it popped with a splat. If you were lucky, you got a cut of actual meat. If not, you made do with snout, or tongue, or a bit of ear fat. Organs went fast. Liver, kidneys, heart, though they turned bad fast too. In the summer, meat spoiled before the blood even dried, so they smoked it, or salted it, or buried it in lard. Preservation was more wishful than effective. Insects wriggled in by day 2. Maggots showed up by day 4. And by day 6, if you scraped off the grey fuzz and roasted it long enough, you probably wouldn't die. Probably. This was normal. Markets didn't sell clean cuts. They sold hunks, hacked on wooden blocks, dark with decades of grease. The butcher's knife was never washed. His apron had stains older than his apprentice. You picked your meat by colour, smell, and how few things were visibly crawling on it. Poultry wasn't better. Chickens lived inside the house, literally. They walked around your feet, pooped on the floor, laid eggs under the bed. When their time came, they were plucked and boiled until their skins sloughed off like wet paper. Sometimes feathers were left behind. You just picked them out. And if you couldn't afford a whole bird, you bought parts: beaks, necks, feet. The feet were considered a delicacy, especially once boiled into a grey gelatinous soup that quivered when it cooled. Fish? Same story. Same. Salt cod came in rock, hard slabs that had to be soaked for days. Eel was common, cheap, slimy, and resistant to rot. If the water source wasn't too filthy, you might catch your own. If it was, you probably still ate it, just boiled it longer. Rotten meat wasn't thrown away, it was cooked harder. People added vinegar, garlic, or ale to mask the smell. Spoiled meat was mixed with onions or mustard seed. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it just made the taste confusing. Either way, you swallowed it, slowly, and hoped it stayed down. Food poisoning was common, but it wasn't called that. It was just a bad belly, a curse, a punishment from God. You curled up in bed, sweating through your tunic, and prayed the diarrhea wouldn't kill you faster than the winter cold. Still, hunger was constant. And when the salted pork was gone, the chickens had stopped laying, and even the roots had withered in storage. People got creative. Enter the rat, not as a pest, but as your dinner. In cities, rats were everywhere. They scurried across rafters, gnawed through bags, nested in hay, and occasionally bit sleeping children. You could hear them at night, clicking, scratching, squealing. But when your belly was empty and the stew pot hadn't seen meat in a week, that sound started to mean something else. A rat was food, fast, available, and only slightly more disease-ridden than everything else on the table. They were trapped, clubbed, boiled, and, if you had the energy, skinned. The meat was greyish-pink, oily, and clung to the bone like it was afraid to leave. You stewed it with herbs if you had any. Onion tops, bitter greens, garlic cloves grown soft with mould. If you didn't have herbs, you just boiled it longer. It wasn't about taste, it was about not dying. Rats weren't the only things that made it into the pot. Birds, if you could catch them. Pigeons were a favourite. They lived in chimneys and rafters, fat on city crumbs. Easy to net, though harder to pluck. Still, their bones added flavour, and the meat was just enough to make soup taste like something other than despair. Frogs were common near marshes. So were snails. So were bugs, beetles, larvae, worms. And in sieges, when all other options ran out, people turned inward. There are accounts from medieval famines, where leather was boiled for days, scraped of mould, and chewed until it dissolved. Shoes were eaten, book bindings, ropes, candles if they were made with tallow. Dogs disappeared, then cats, then family goats. Parents boiled grass for their children. In one of the worst recorded famines of the 14th century, people in parts of France and Germany were found boiling bones dug up from graveyards. Not for meat, just marrow. The broth wasn't nutritious, but it was warm. Some went further. Chroniclers, never ones to underplay misery, described cannibalism in hushed, horrified tones. A mother caught roasting her child. A man dragging corpses from plague carts under cover of night. Whether these stories were true, exaggerated, or a medieval version of tabloid horror, it hardly mattered. People believed them. You didn't need much imagination to picture someone doing the unthinkable. And when bodies weren't being eaten, they were being examined, not with gloves, with knives, by people who called themselves healers. Doctor was a loose title in the Middle Ages. It could mean a scholar trained in ancient texts. It could mean a barber with a steady hand. Or it could mean a wandering apothecary who kept dried frogs in his pocket and swore by powdered emeralds as a cure for syphilis. And somehow they all agreed on one thing. If you were sick, the answer was to make you leak. Blood, bile, sweat, pus didn't matter. As long as something came out of you, they assumed the illness was going with it. Bloodletting was the medieval gold standard. Too hot? Too red in the face? Feeling melancholic? That's an excess of blood. A good lancing would balance your humours. Sometimes they used a knife, sometimes a thorn, sometimes a leech. Leeches were considered elegant, clean, intelligent even. They knew just how much to take. They were applied to temples, necks, armpits, and, when things got truly dire, unmentionable regions. You'd sit still bleeding, while a black slug gorged itself on your fevered lifeblood. People collected their own leeches from the river, if they were brave, or they bought them from collectors who had waded through stagnant bogs with bare legs, letting the creatures attach naturally. Leech bite wounds bled for hours, sometimes days. Perfume existed, in theory, but most people wore scent satchels. Bags of dried herbs hung around the neck to block out the smell of their own armpits. Baths were rare, sweat was constant, and soap, that was a journey. Homemade soap required animal fat, wood ash, and hours of boiling. It smelled, how you'd expect, like regret. Fancy soaps imported from Castile or Aleppo were reserved for the rich, and even they didn't use them often. Hair care was equally inventive. Washing your hair meant using lye, stale ale, vinegar or eggs, all of which worked technically, but also stripped your scalp, dried your hair, and left you smelling like a pub floor. Greasy hair was hidden under veils, coifs or wide-brimmed hats. Lice, a daily fact of life. People kept lice combs on hand and shared them freely. And when combing didn't work, they turned to shaving. Yes, many medieval men and women shaved their heads entirely and wore wigs made from horsehair, goat wool, or, if they were lucky, human donations. These wigs were rarely washed. They were powdered, perfumed, and home to entire colonies of insects. And don't forget the nails. Long nails were impractical, so most people kept them short, by biting. Nail care was less about polish and more about scraping out dirt with a knife. If your nails were black, you were normal. If they were pink, people worried you were sick. In short, hygiene wasn't about being clean. It was about managing decay, keeping it slow, hiding it with flour, soot and boiled rosewater. You didn't aim for radiant health. You aimed for not actively leaking. And if all else failed, a veil, a smile, and the confident belief that no one else smelled better than you. There were rules in the Middle Ages, sort of. Not the kind enforced by law, but the kind that got you strange looks across the table if you failed to observe them. Like not blowing your nose into the tablecloth, or not flinging chicken bones into the fire too enthusiastically. Let's begin with the table. Tables weren't always permanent. In many homes, they were literal boards laid over barrels or trestles. You ate sitting on stools, or benches, or the ground, depending on your status and the current mood of the furniture. Tablecloths existed, but not for decoration. They were multi-purpose. Wipe your fingers, wipe your mouth, blow your nose, clean your knife. If you were polite, you did it discreetly. If you weren't, you did it mid-sentence and flicked it off the edge. Personal plates? Not common. Most people ate off trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as edible plates. They soaked up gravy, fat and anything spilled. At the end of the meal, you could eat the trencher if you were hungry, or give it to the poor, or the dogs. Same thing really. Utensils were optional. Everyone had a knife. It hung from your belt and doubled as your dinnerware. You stabbed, sliced and shoved. Forks were exotic, viewed with suspicion in many parts of Europe. Fingers were trusted more. Greasy, unwashed, calloused fingers that had probably touched livestock that morning. You ate with your right hand. The left was for other things. Water bowls were passed around to rinse fingers. Communal. One bowl, no soap, just a murky swirl of medieval essence you politely pretended was helpful. As for drinking, 1 cup per table. It passed from hand to hand, lip to lip. If someone slobbered too much, you wiped it with your sleeve and smiled. Now, spitting. Spitting indoors was normal, expected even. The only rule, aim away from the table, ideally under your bench or into the rushes covering the floor. Rushes were bundles of straw, herbs, and whatever filth had accumulated over the past few months. They soaked up spills, muffled steps, and disguised smells, sometimes. People spat phlegm, chewed bones and spat the fragments, or spat out bits of gristle, all while talking. It was a rhythmic, communal thing. If you didn't spit, you might be hiding something. Blowing your nose was fine, just not with your hands. That was vulgar. Instead, use your sleeve, or the corner of the tablecloth, or someone else's sleeve, if you were married. Belching? A compliment to the cook. Farting? Depends on the company. Vomiting? Tricky. At feasts, nobles sometimes ate until they physically couldn't anymore. So they stepped outside, vomited behind a tree or into a bucket, wiped their face, and returned for more. It wasn't considered disgusting, it was efficient. There was even a specific servant whose job was to hold the bucket. They were often tipped. And speaking of tipping, don't tip your chair. It's a medieval bench, it will collapse. Don't rest your elbows on the table if you're with nobility. Don't reach across someone else's bowl unless you're confident you can do it without dragging your sleeve through the gravy. And absolutely, do not laugh so hard you spray pottage on a lord's tunic, unless you want to be escorted out by your ears. Toilets, outside, if possible, but not far. At many feasts, guests would relieve themselves behind the hall, or, if drunk enough, behind a tapestry. It was customary to pretend you didn't notice. Public urination was extremely common. Men went where they pleased, walls, corners, wells unfortunately. Women squatted in alleys or used chamber pots, under long dresses, then dumped the contents into the street. "Gardy-loo" was shouted as a courtesy before throwing waste from an upper window. It means look out for the water. The water was not water. Sneezing was ominous. People blessed you instantly. Fast, loud. They thought sneezes meant the soul was trying to escape. Failing to say bless you was borderline spiritual negligence. Some nobles even hired professional blessers for large events. And if you yawned without covering your mouth, that meant you were rude, or possibly possessed. Manners mattered. But they weren't about cleanliness. They were about knowing when to swallow your bones, when to fling them, and when to apologise for doing both at once. But if you flung your bones at the wrong person, say, a nobleman's mistress, or the bishop's favourite hound, you might find yourself dragged from the feast straight to the town square. Because while medieval manners were flexible, punishment was not, and it was rarely quiet. Justice in the Middle Ages was public, painful, and above all, performative. The goal wasn't just to punish the guilty, it was to send a message, to make an example, to make sure that every child in the village remembered exactly what happened to the man who stole a goose during Lent. The town square wasn't just for markets and dancing, it doubled as a stage. Wooden platforms, iron posts, hanging hooks, cages, stocks, everything arranged with the precision of a theatre set. The whole town came out to watch. Children perched on shoulders. Merchants paused mid-sale. Nobles arrived with snacks. Executions were scheduled in advance. Market day was ideal. Maximum foot traffic. And the condemned? They were walked through town in chains, often barefoot, sometimes half naked, always dirty. People threw cabbage stalks, dung, insults. If you were lucky, you got one last prayer. If not, one last spit in the face. Then came the punishment. If you were being hanged, it wasn't the tidy drop and snap from movies. It was slower, crueler. The short drop left you swinging, kicking, strangling for minutes, eyes bulging, face darkening. Children watched in fascination. Parents explained the crime between bites of bread. If the punishment was more involved, the executioner would reach for his tools. Not swords, tools. The wheel, the hook, the tongs. The wheel, sometimes called the breaking wheel, was a favourite in Germany and France. The victim was tied to it, limbs spread, and then beaten with iron bars, each bone broken methodically. Sometimes the wheel was spun for effect. Sometimes it was hoisted and left on display, the mangled body drying in the wind. Then there was drawing and quartering. This one was reserved for traitors, men who betrayed their king or their god. First you were hanged, but not to death, just enough to make you faint. Then you were cut down, stripped, castrated. Your genitals were burned in front of you. Then your stomach was sliced open, your intestines pulled out, and also set on fire. You remained alive as long as possible. Eventually, your head was removed. Your body cut into quarters, each piece sent to a different city gate as a warning. This is what happens when you forget your place. But not all executions were so grand. Sometimes you were just boiled. In oil, in wine, in lead. For coin forgery, mostly. A punishment specific to economic betrayal. The liquid bubbled as you were lowered in slowly, screaming until your lungs stopped working. And sometimes they didn't even kill you. They just humiliated you. Stocks, pillories, public whippings, branding, tongue removal, nose slitting. Ears cut off and nailed to the gallows post with a helpful sign that read, "Thief." But that was just the surface. Real punishment. The kind reserved for enemies of the state, heretics, witches, and those who simply refused to confess, took place below ground. In chambers that weren't built for justice, but endurance, the torture chamber. It wasn't just a dungeon, it was an idea, a room where truth bent around pain, where confessions flowed not from guilt, but from the exact moment your shoulder dislocated with a pop. Torture was legal, regulated even. You needed permission, a signed writ, a scribe to record the questions. Rules were in place, theoretically. In practice, it was a cold room, a heavy door, and a man in an apron who didn't ask your name, just what hurt the most. Tools hung on the walls, like kitchenware. Hooks, pulleys, chains, blades. Some were simple, others too imaginative for comfort. Let's start with the strappado. You were hoisted by the wrists, arms tied behind your back, then dropped suddenly, but not to the floor. Just enough to wrench your shoulders from their sockets. Silence meant another drop, and another. Until something gave, or the rack. A wooden frame with rollers at each end. Ankles tied one way, wrists the other. Then, turn by turn, you were stretched. Tendons tore, joints cracked, the body elongated beyond its design. You didn't scream at first, you gurgled, and once you started talking, they didn't stop turning right away. For smaller crimes, or particularly stubborn heretics, there were thumb screws. Just 2 metal plates and a turning rod. Enough to crush your fingers flat. Some torturers added spikes inside, because pressure wasn't always enough. Then there was the boot. Your foot was encased in iron, heated or hammered, or slowly filled with wedges until the bones inside split like dry wood. Many didn't walk again, which was fine. You weren't expected to leave. One of the cruelest was the heretic's fork. 2 prongs, one pointed at the chin, the other at the chest, strapped tightly around the neck. If your head drooped even slightly, the fork stabbed in. You stayed awake. You stayed upright. You prayed to faint, but rarely did. And of course the infamous pear of anguish, a metal object shaped like a flower bud, inserted into the mouth, or the rectum, or the vagina, depending on the crime. A screw turned, the petals opened, slowly, deliberately, until the soft tissue tore from the inside out. Some of these are debated, romanticized, maybe never used widely, but the threat of them was real. And sometimes that was enough. People confessed to crimes they hadn't heard of. Witches admitted to flying. Heretics confessed to kissing goats. Adulterers gave the names of lovers they'd never touched. Because in the chamber, truth bent like the body. And once it bent too far, it didn't come back. Let's look at what happened after the pain. Because in medieval Europe, your punishment didn't always end with death. Sometimes, it followed you into death itself. You didn't just die, you were displayed. Let's start with gibbets, iron cages shaped like humans, designed to hold what was left of you. After hanging, your corpse was crammed inside. Arms stiff, bones poking through blackened skin, skull sagging forward like it still regretted the crime. The cage was then hoisted on a tall wooden post at the city gate. There it hung, day and night, swinging in the wind. Birds came first, then flies, then maggots. Children pointed, travellers stared. Your body became part of the landscape, part landmark, part lesson, and it stayed there for months, years, until you were bone and rust and some scraps of skin flapping like flags. Other bodies were cut apart. Quartering wasn't the end of it. It was just the start of logistics. Each limb was packed in brine or pitched to slow decay, then carted off to major roads, village squares, and castle walls. The head, if intact, was mounted on a pike, sometimes dipped in tar to help it last through the seasons. London Bridge alone hosted dozens at a time, each one a face once attached to a voice that said the wrong thing too loudly. Executioners weren't just killers, they were preservationists. Their job wasn't finished until the last part of you was nailed in place. Sometimes you weren't even dead. Criminals were buried alive, not often, but it happened. Walled up in cloisters, entombed in punishment pits, especially if you were a nun who broke her vows or a monk who tried to escape. The idea was poetic. You sinned in secret, now die in silence. One chronicler described a nun who confessed under torture, then was sealed in a brick cell, no wider than her arms. A hole allowed food in, for a while, until it didn't. And if you weren't buried or gibbeted, you might be burned. Witches, heretics, scholars with the wrong ideas. The fire wasn't always quick. Damp wood slowed it. Wind blew smoke back into your face. Ropes burned through before your body did. You didn't always scream. Sometimes the heat boiled your brain before your lungs could beg. People gathered to watch. Vendors sold ale. Jesters made jokes. It was a spectacle, a community moment. And it wasn't all for justice. Sometimes it was for fun. Records survive of men flayed alive, not because of a trial, but because their death was seen as entertainment, a show, a crowd pleaser. One skin was nailed to the city gate for years. It curled in the sun like parchment. Children touched it for luck. Lovers carved initials into it. Eventually, no one remembered the name of the man it came from, but they remembered the story. The way the wind made his skin flap on the gatepost like wet sausage. And with that in mind, let's take a journey. A literal one. You see, in the Middle Ages, travel was less of a cheerful trot through the countryside, and more of an exercise in risk, rashes, and praying you didn't end up as the next skin memo nailed to someone's wall. Most people didn't travel, not because they didn't want to, but because it was expensive, dangerous, and confusing. Roads were muddy at best, impassable at worst. Maps were vague, signposts were rare, and if you didn't know someone at the next village, you might end up sleeping in a ditch under a tree, with one eye open for wolves and the other for tax collectors. If you were on foot, you moved slow, real slow, maybe 10 miles a day if the weather was good and your boots hadn't disintegrated. Boots, by the way, were handmade leather, often unlined, often reused and rarely dry. Feet blistered, toenails blackened, socks weren't changed, because socks didn't exist for most peasants. Riding a horse didn't make things much better. Horses were valuable. If you had one, you were a target. Bandits didn't just want your coin, they wanted your transportation. And if they couldn't take your horse, they'd take your saddle, your cloak, your teeth. Yes, teeth. Gold fillings weren't a thing yet, but decent molars were prized, especially by rougher types with a personal interest in dentistry. Travellers carried weapons, a dagger, a club, a rusty sword if they were lucky and mildly delusional. Because the roads were home to more than just pilgrims and merchants. There were bandits, mercenaries between wars, stray soldiers who hadn't gotten the memo that peace was signed. And then there were the inns. Oh, the inns. Imagine a barn, but louder, full of fleas, damp straw in the corner, four-legged things scurrying across beams, drunks snoring, someone vomiting behind the fire pit, and a man with a twitchy eye who keeps asking if you're travelling alone. Beds were shared. Not with friends, with whoever paid for the other half. You slept next to strangers, sometimes strangers with open sores, or chronic flatulence, or both. There were no locks. You tied your belongings to your ankle with rope. You slept in your boots. Because if something wasn't stolen, it crawled away on its own. Meals were included. but you'd rather they weren't. Pottage was standard, an eternal stew that never emptied, just refilled. Carrots, onions, turnips, meat of mysterious origin. If the cook liked you, they might say duck. If they didn't, they might wink and say, not dog. Bread came hard as slate, ale came warm and sour, cheese came green, and bathrooms, a hole. Maybe, out back, or a chamber pot passed from hand to hand, still warm from the last user. You didn't ask, you didn't look, you just emptied and prayed. Getting sick on the road wasn't an if, it was a when. Bad food, bad water, bad air. Colds became coughs, coughs became wheezing. Diarrhea was common enough to have its own travel prayers. You wrapped yourself in wool, drank vinegar, and hoped you'd reach the next village before your guts betrayed you completely. But for all that misery, people still travelled. Merchants braved the mud to sell spices and silk. Pilgrims limped across countries to kiss relics and beg forgiveness. Messengers galloped through sleet with scrolls under their tunics. They walked through rain, through fog, through corpses on the roadside. And when they arrived, they told their stories. Exaggerated, embellished, unbelievable, but remembered. Because if you survived the road, you earned the right to brag about it. Congratulations. Except you are probably sick now. Not rest and drink water, sick. More like the you'll either be healed or buried by Sunday sick. And so you arrived at a medieval hospital. Not a place of sterile halls and white linens, but a combination of church, hospice, charity shelter, and biohazard waiting to happen. Hospitals weren't run by doctors. They were run by monks and nuns, religious orders, pious souls who believed healing the body helped save the soul, which was admirable, but also impractical, because most had no medical training, just a strong stomach and blind faith. Beds were wooden, narrow, packed into long open halls, no curtains, no privacy. You could have a fractured leg on the left, a plague case on the right, and a rotting foot at the end of your own mattress, all breathing, moaning, and occasionally soiling themselves in glorious medieval harmony. You shared your pillow, you shared your blanket, you shared the air. The smell was beyond description, sweet and sour, blood and damp wool, piss, Moldavian ointments made of lard and garlic, old meat, rotten teeth. It clung to your hair, it wept from the walls. Treatment depended on the ailment and the mood of the monk. Cough? You were bled. Swelling? More bleeding. Infection? Hot compresses and prayers. If they were really trying, you got a poultice. Maybe made of honey and herbs, maybe animal dung and moss, maybe ground oyster shells soaked in vinegar and smeared into the wound while someone whispered a psalm. There were leeches, always leeches, applied with confidence and collected in pots once they'd drunk their fill. The pot was stored under the bed, sometimes forgotten. Urine was collected daily and analysed for colour, texture and scent. A monk might swirl it in a glass and nod solemnly while muttering something about divine imbalance. You, of course, were in no position to disagree. Food was basic, pottage again, watery ale, stale bread, sometimes cheese. If you could eat, you were improving. If you couldn't, they lit a candle. And if you died, your bed wasn't changed, your body was moved, slowly, folded up in the same blanket, dragged to the chapel, and then buried in the hospital yard, under a wooden marker that said little and rotted quickly. Beds were reused by nightfall, people prayed, nuns wept, the straw was fluffed, and the next patient arrived. If you didn't trust monks with knives or couldn't afford a hospital bed, you had one last option, faith. So you became a pilgrim. You strapped on your pack, picked a saint, and began walking. For days, weeks, months, you limped across hills, through rain, mud, and swollen rivers toward a relic that promised divine healing. A piece of the true cross, a splinter of a martyr's femur, a scrap of the Virgin Mary's cloak, one of many. Pilgrimage was not glamorous. Your feet blistered, your skin cracked, your pack rubbed sores into your shoulders. You drank from streams shared with animals. You ate crusts offered by strangers. You slept in barns, in hedges, in plague shelters. You wore a badge to show your intent, a scallop shell for Santiago, a tin cross for Canterbury, a cheap metal token that told the world, "Don't rob me, I'm doing this for my soul." People still robbed you. Bandits didn't care about saints, and not every shrine delivered miracles. Some relics were real, some were sheep bones in fancy boxes, but pilgrims didn't ask questions. You kissed the glass, whispered your prayer, left a coin, rubbed your forehead on the reliquary, hoping to absorb holiness like ointment. In some places you could buy bottled miracles, holy water collected near the tomb, oil from lamps kept burning by monks, dirt from the sacred grave. You took it home in a vial, wore it around your neck, and hoped your boils respected the purchase. Some pilgrims were healed, some weren't. Many just collapsed on the road and were buried in borrowed graves under carved stones that read "Pilgrim" and nothing more. Now let's move on to animals. They were everywhere in the Middle Ages, inside your home, on your food, under your feet, and sometimes on your face while you slept. Homes were infested with rats, lice, fleas, and bedbugs. Beds weren't safe, clothes weren't clean, children were sometimes bitten in their sleep. And no matter how many prayers you whispered before bed, it was never enough to keep the itching away. Let's begin with the walls. Medieval houses were made of wattle and daub, basically mud, straw, sticks, and dried manure plastered together into something vaguely house-shaped. Warm in winter, yes, but also full of gaps. Gaps that let in air, water, and everything with tiny legs. Rats nested in the walls, mice ran across rafters, fleas jumped from one sleeping body to the next like tiny acrobats of misery. And under the bed, a party. With all that life came all that waste. There were no sewage systems, no street sweepers, no regular clean-up. What went in one end of the animal eventually ended up in the road, and it stayed there. Every hoof left more behind. Horses dropped enormous piles, oxen larger still, dogs left trails, chickens added splats, pigs didn't even wait until they were outside. Everything mixed together. Rain didn't clean it, it stirred it, turned dried droppings into thick brown paste, made gutters overflow with a slurry of excrement, offal, spoiled food, and the occasional dead rat. In summer, it baked. In winter, it froze into slippery slabs of hazard. And people walked through it. Shoes were basic, thin leather soles, often full of holes. Some wore wooden platforms called pattens to lift themselves out of the muck, but most just trudged through, feet blackened, toes rotted, skin cracked. Some diseases didn't even need fleas. They came up through your soles. Markets were the worst. Butchers slaughtered on sight. Blood ran across cobbles. Fishmongers tossed guts aside. Farmers dumped spoiled produce in the corner. Add animal dung and chamber pot contents flung from windows, and you had yourself a true medieval cocktail. Everyone knew to avoid the middle of the road. That's where the waste settled. You stuck to the sides, unless someone was relieving themselves out a window above you. "Gardy loo!" was shouted as a warning. Not always loudly enough, not always at all. The smell soaked into walls, clothes, lungs. Visitors gagged. Locals didn't notice. It was the smell of trade, of labour, of survival. Some towns tried to fight back. Street ordinances were passed, butchers fined, chamber pot dumpers punished. But enforcement was rare, and the filth returned faster than the fines. In the Middle Ages, going to the bathroom wasn't private, it wasn't comfortable, and it definitely wasn't clean. Toilets, as we think of them, didn't exist. What people had instead were holes, buckets, trenches, wooden benches with suspiciously dark stains. And sometimes, if you were in a castle, an architectural miracle called the garderobe. Let's start there. The garderobe was a shaft built into the outer wall of a castle or tower. You sat on a cold stone or wood seat, and your waste dropped straight down into the moat, or a pit, or sometimes just the earth. There was no flushing, no wiping unless you counted moss or handfuls of straw. The best castles angled the shaft outward, so it didn't run back down the wall. Not all did. Servants were assigned to clean the pits. They didn't always do it, which meant the smell drifted back up the shaft, permanently. You sat there doing your business, breathing in centuries of rot. It was humbling. It was awful. And it was better than what most people had. Villagers used buckets, simple wooden pails, often shared among the family, topped with a board for sitting. When full, someone, usually a child, carried it outside to dump into the nearest cesspit, or the street, or the river, or behind the neighbour's fence if relations were strained. Chamber pots served the same purpose inside. Convenient, yes, but they filled quickly, and not everyone was good about emptying them. The smell turned corners into danger zones. Some chamber pots were decorative, painted ceramic, brass or pewter, still just a bucket of waste. In monasteries, communal latrines lined up holes over a shared trough. Waste flowed into a channel below, sometimes flushed with water from a diverted stream. Ingenious, occasionally effective, often terrifying. Falling in was rare, but not unheard of. And then there were the accidents. People fell into cesspits, fell off guardrobe seats, missed the pot in the dark. One well-documented story tells of a king's relative who tumbled from a toilet shaft and drowned in his own waste. A royal flush, but not the celebratory kind. Public facilities, almost non-existent. Some towns had privies, public toilets built over ditches, usually near taverns or markets. The smell hit you long before the door. These places were rarely cleaned, covered in flies, and occasionally home to rats. If you felt something brush your leg, you didn't investigate. You just prayed it wasn't still attached. Toilet paper? Not a thing. You wiped with moss, rags, straw, leaves, your hand, then rinsed in the river, right where people collected water. Which helps explain everything. And if you were too sick to make it outside, you used the bedpan, which was exactly what it sounds like. And if you couldn't lift yourself, you soiled the bed. It happened. Frequently. Sheets were rarely washed, mattresses soaked. Some people slept on mats that had absorbed years of accidents. No one mentioned it. No one had the strength. Sanitation was not about removing waste. It was about surviving near it. The fact that anyone lived past 40 is a testament to pure stubbornness. And once you weren't stubborn enough anymore, they buried you. Fast. Not out of respect, out of necessity. Medieval people didn't wait around to deal with corpses. Bodies rotted quickly. The smell of death wasn't poetic. It was acidic, clinging, and unmistakable. If someone died in your home, the countdown began. You had roughly 2 days to dig, pray, and cover. Less in summer, more if the ground wasn't frozen solid. The wealthy were lucky. They had funerals with incense, linen shrouds, carved stone markers. Priests muttered blessings. Bells tolled. A procession followed the coffin. Sometimes paid mourners wailed dramatically enough to make strangers cry. But that was the exception. Most people got dirt and a hole. There were no embalming fluids, no preservation. The best you could hope for was to be wrapped tightly and buried deep, usually in a communal grave, sometimes stacked with others. You weren't buried in shoes or pants or anything you could pass on to the living. Clothes were expensive. They were taken off the body, washed sometimes, and given to someone else. If they didn't fit, they were sold. Graves weren't dug with care. The gravedigger was not sentimental. He was tired, underpaid, and already thinking about his next hole. You were lowered in with a rope or a shove. A prayer might be said. A stone might be placed, but most markers were wood, and wood didn't last long. If the cemetery was full, you were stacked, shoved into a trench, covered and forgotten until someone else needed the space. Rain washed names away. Dogs dug shallow graves open. Floods carried bones downstream. But the system worked, mostly. Until the rot began. Once the soil hit your face and the final prayer was muttered, or mumbled, or skipped entirely, that was it. You were left to the earth. And the earth got to work. Decomposition didn't wait for a full moon or divine permission. It began immediately. First came the bloating. Gases built up in your gut, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide. thanks to the friendly bacteria that had spent your life quietly helping you digest cabbage. Now they turned on you, feasting on your organs in a final act of microbial betrayal. The abdomen swelled, skin stretched tight, then split with a wet hiss. If you were buried shallow and the ground was warm, the body might balloon until the face puffed beyond recognition. Eyelids popped, tongue swelled, eyes went soft and slipped inward, like poached eggs left too long. Fluids pooled. They leaked from the nose, the mouth, the ears. A greenish-black slime oozed from any opening, saturating the shroud. If animals dug down fast enough, they caught you just as things got juicy. Dogs, rats, crows, even pigs if they were near enough. Worms arrived shortly after, specifically fly larvae, maggots. Within hours of death, flies had laid eggs around the eyes, mouth, and open wounds. These hatched into pale, wriggling creatures that burrowed into soft tissue. Lips vanished first, then cheeks, then eyes. Hair sometimes stayed, skin didn't. The top layer peeled back in sheets, slipping off the hands like gloves. Fingernails detached, toes curled inward. If the air was dry, the outer tissue hardened. If it was wet, it slid. And beneath all that, bones. The flesh took weeks, months, depending on the soil, the moisture, the time of year. A body buried in winter might last well into spring before truly collapsing. One buried in summer could be nearly skeletonized within a few weeks. But it was never clean. Ligaments lingered, cartilage clung, marrow soured inside the bone. The smell, even underground, was overwhelming. Gravediggers wore no gloves, no masks, just old tunics and stronger stomachs than anyone alive today. If the cemetery flooded, corpses surfaced, half rotted, gasping through the mud, swollen tongues hanging out of shattered jaws. Children stumbled across them. Priests called it a bad omen. Gravediggers just dragged them back in. And sometimes, just sometimes, bodies were dug up on purpose. Graves were robbed. Regularly. Sometimes within days of burial. Sometimes the same night. The moment the last mourner turned away, someone else approached. Quiet, fast, holding a spade. Why rob a grave? Plenty of reasons. Let's start with clothes. Even though families tried to reclaim garments before burial, not all did. And anything buried with you, cloak, belt, shoes, rings, was fair game. Even simple wool tunics fetched a price if you knew who to sell to. Robbers didn't need finesse. They needed fingers fast enough to yank boots off a corpse before rigour set in. Then came jewellery. Rarer, but more rewarding. A brooch on a noblewoman's collar, a coin in a dead man's mouth. Rings were prized, even if they had to be pried off swollen, decaying fingers. Some robbers brought knives, not to defend themselves, but to remove a finger that wouldn't give up its gold. Teeth were next. Yes, teeth. Human teeth were a booming business. Rich clients wanted dentures, tooth pullers wanted spare parts, and corpses had no use for their molars anymore. The front teeth fetched the best price, pulled with pliers, wiped on cloth, sold by candlelight behind the apothecary, and then bones. Grave robbers didn't always work alone. Some worked for others, for doctors, for surgeons, for barbers who wanted to impress clients with a little anatomical flair. Dissection was frowned upon, illegal in many places, so bodies were acquired through unofficial channels. Robbers sold full skeletons, partial limbs, even skulls, scrubbed poorly, packed in straw, delivered to dark basements. And then there were the religious relics. Churches bought bones, saints' bones specifically. If you could find an old grave, preferably near a monastery, you could dig, clean, and pass off the remains as holy. A finger bone became St. Bartholomew's knuckle. A femur became Saint Margaret's thigh. Add a little incense and a Latin label, and voila, pilgrims lined up to kiss the glass. Even plague pits weren't safe. People believed they held power, that the remains of the cursed could cure or protect. Bits of skull were ground into powder. Ashes were bottled. One legend even tells of grave dust sold as love powder. Just sprinkle on a garment and wait. And if you got caught, punishments varied: fines, brandings, public shaming. One thief was forced to bury every corpse he'd stolen from, by hand with prayer, barefoot. It took months, but most weren't caught. They worked fast, dug quietly, left no trace, except the empty grave and a faint smell of regret. But even if the robbers didn't empty your grave, the church eventually would. Not out of greed, out of necessity. Medieval burial grounds had limits, physical ones. Grave space was finite, populations weren't, and the dead just kept coming. Plague, war, cold winters, hot summers, a bad harvest. All it took was one unlucky month, and the churchyard swelled like a bloated corpse under a thin skin of grass. So graves were reused. That meant digging up the old to make room for the new. It wasn't personal, it wasn't sacrilegious, it was practical. If your bones had been in the ground long enough to lose their name, you were considered done. A priest said a short prayer, a gravedigger lifted your remains into a cart, and you were relocated. Your new home? The Charnal house. It sat just beside the church, dark and quiet, with a wooden door that groaned like it didn't want to be opened. Inside, shelves, alcoves, stacks, no coffins, no ceremony, just bones, dry, cracked, stained with soil. Skulls were piled in corners like onions. Femurs leaned against walls. Ribs were thrown into baskets. Small bones, the hands, the feet, the vertebrae, tumbled loose across the floor like dead men's confetti. Some were marked, most weren't. If a skull still had hair, it was shaved. If a jaw was stuck shut, it was pried open. You didn't want a grimace on display. You wanted something blank, clean, orderly. The bones yellowed with age, but they weren't left to rot. They were organised. In some places, they were stacked into neat geometric walls. In others, they were simply shovelled into a pit and forgotten. And in a few, just a few, the bones were turned into art. That's when a charnel house became an ossuary. Not a warehouse, a shrine. The most famous ossuaries came later, but the practice began in the Middle Ages. Bone altars, skull walls, chandeliers made from femurs and phalanges, pelvises arranged into flowers, vertebrae framed stained glass. It was both grotesque and holy. A message written in calcium, memento mori. Remember, you will die too. Pilgrims visited. Priests gave sermons surrounded by grins. Children whispered names into the skulls and waited to see if they blinked. The smell was gone. Time had scraped it away. What remained was a dry silence and the soft click of bone against stone. But not every ossuary was built from peace. Sometimes people were dug up too early. Sometimes the flesh hadn't finished falling away. Gravediggers pried jaws open to speed decomposition. They boiled skulls in lye, scraped skin from ribs with iron tools. It was all part of the job. The living needed space, and the dead, they didn't argue. In the Middle Ages, death wasn't just an end, it was a doorway, and sometimes things came back through it the wrong way. People didn't fear dying so much as they feared what happened after. Not in the heavenly sense, not even in the infernal sense. What kept them up at night was the very real belief that the dead could rise, not as ghosts, as revenants. Revenants weren't poetic phantoms whispering riddles in moonlight. They were bloated, blackened, leaking corpses that got up anyway, crawled from graves, staggered into homes, gurgled through clotted throats, their skin stretched tight, their eyes bulging, their mouths torn as if they'd died mid-scream, and then decided to keep screaming. In medieval accounts, revenants came back for one reason: unfinished business, sometimes vengeance, sometimes hunger, sometimes sheer spite. One famous 12th century tale tells of a man in England so despised that villagers feared even his corpse might cause harm. And they were right. After his burial, people claimed to hear groans beneath the ground. Scratching, then thumps, then nothing, until a few days later, villagers began dying in their sleep. The man had returned, they said, his corpse swollen and dark, strangling the living one by one. So they dug him up, and what they found terrified them. He was too fresh, too intact. His eyes were open, his mouth full of blood. So they did what any reasonable town would do. They cut off his head, burned his body, and scattered the ashes, just in case. That was the accepted protocol for restless dead. Dig them up, behead them, burn the body, and bury the ashes far from consecrated ground, preferably near running water. If you couldn't manage that, at least drive a stake through the chest, or the mouth, or the gut, or all three. Villages kept stakes ready. Some sharpened hawthorn branches, others used iron rods. A few simply nailed corpses to the ground with long wooden pegs, like pinning down an angry tent. This wasn't superstition on the fringes. Clergy wrote about it. Chroniclers documented it in grave detail. Grave robbing was one thing. Grave fearing was another entirely. And then there was the danse macabre, the dance of death. Everywhere you looked, bones danced. On church murals, in manuscripts, on tomb carvings, grinning skeletons in fine robes dragging kings from their thrones. Corpses leading peasants and bishops hand in hand toward the grave. The message was simple. Death didn't care about status, wealth, youth, clean fingernails. But beneath the message was a terror that death wasn't done with you. Plague reinforced the fear. Towns littered with bodies, burials in haste, no rites, no priests, just a mound of dirt and the hope the thing under it wouldn't come back angry. Some believed plague victims were more likely to return, their deaths too sudden, too chaotic, too cursed. In some places, people began burying the dead with stones in their mouths. Heavy ones, to prevent biting. Others placed scythes across the necks of corpses, so if they sat up, the blade would do its work. And then there were sin-eaters. In parts of Britain and Central Europe, sin-eaters were hired to consume the sins of the dead. A piece of bread was placed on the corpse, a bowl of ale. The sin-eater would sit beside the body, eat the bread, drink the ale, and symbolically take the soul's unconfessed sins into themselves. This, of course, made the sin-eater feared, tainted, untouchable. They were seen as walking vessels of corruption, living ghost traps. Some say they didn't live long. Others say they never stayed in one place. But it was all part of the same idea. The dead weren't quiet. They weren't clean. They weren't done. They creaked in floorboards. They leaked into dreams. They whispered from beneath thin soil when the wind blew just right. People avoided graveyards after dusk. Dogs refused to enter them. And if someone died violently, you salted the doorway. You hung iron near the bed. You whispered prayers into knots of hair and buried them at crossroads. Crossroads confused spirits. And confusion, apparently, was better than confrontation. Not all returning dead were evil, of course. Some were lonely. Old wives' tales told of mothers who rose to nurse the babies they'd left behind. Lovers who wandered cold hills looking for warm arms. Children who came back only to sit at the hearth again, silent, watching. But these weren't the comforting spirits of later folklore. These were corpses, half-bodies, misshapen, dripping reminders that death in the Middle Ages was messy, unfinished business. There were even records of people burying corpses upside down, face down, limbs twisted. So if they rose, they'd dig downward. Whether it worked is unclear, but no one reported anything coming back up. Thank you for trudging through the muck and marrow of the Middle Ages with me. You've wandered the alleys of plague and prayer, stood beneath gallows, and heard the whispers of bones beneath the churchyard sod. Now the torch is dim, the tolling bells fade, and the village grows quiet. Rest well, weary traveller.